Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Makwariola. In a world where peace is often elusive and conflicts are rarely conclusive, acts of terrorism inspired by religious extremism continue to threaten the future of global order and human existence. September the 11th, 2001 saw the beginning of an era for terrorism after Al-Qaeda terrorists struck the World Trade Center in the United States, killing nearly 3,000 people. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on the way terrorism has evolved in Africa and around the world in the last 16 years? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report and Africa Today will continue. Welcome on board.
President Donald Trump has presided over his first 9/11 commemoration in office, marking the 16th anniversary of the attacks. He and First Lady Melania observed a solemn moment of silence at the White House and later at the Pentagon. Thousands gathered nationwide to mark the deadliest attack on U.S. soil. Nearly 3,000 people died after hijackers crashed planes into New York's World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a rural Pennsylvania field in 2001. The White House commemoration took place at the same time relatives of 9/11 victims, survivors, rescuers, and others gathered at New York's 9/11 Memorial on Monday. At the exact same time, the first plane struck the World Trade Center's North Tower. The names of the 3,000 killed were being read aloud at the 9/11 Memorial and Museum as bells rang out in memory of the dead. Each year on the anniversary, 2 light beams illuminate the sky in place of the 2 towers. Donald Trump, a native New Yorker, also appeared at the Pentagon to again observe a moment of silence at 9:37 local time when U.S. officials say American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the building.
Welcome back. In the wake of 9/11 attacks, the war on terror shaped the blueprint of America's foreign policy, with some crediting it for the upsurge of terrorism and conflict in Africa and around the world. From Mali to Libya, Nigeria to Somalia, insurgents have made the idea of witnessing the next day almost uncertain for residents on the continent. You can join the conversation now, where we have in our studio, Mr. Achike Chude, security expert and political analyst here in the studio. And also on Skype, I have Dr. Martin Ewe, senior researcher, counterterrorism, transnational threats and international crimes at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. Good to have you both on the program. Well, let me begin with you now, Achike. Let's look at the scale of terrorist activities around the globe. What is your assessment, or let me have your thoughts so far on this way things are going right now?
Maybe one word, unprecedented, just as what happened today many years ago in the United States of America was also unprecedented. In fact, there are things that happen you remember for the rest of your life, monumental things. Of course, there was no way you'd be in a hurry to forget what happened that day. I know exactly where I was, when it happened. And for the first time, watching it on television, for the very first time, you see Americans who had always been who were brought up as knowing and believing that America is almost invincible. Because of her might militarily and economically, and the political influence that America has all over the world. For the very first time, that belief, that confidence in America was shaken. I saw fear on the faces of America, that America could be vulnerable. And just like you said in your opening, it changed the whole concept of terrorism. It changed the way terrorism is viewed. And of course, what happened was the rise of one of the most formidable terrorist organizations in the world, that is the Al-Qaeda, of course a forerunner of ISIS. And of course that also brought about all kinds of implications, because there was no way America was going to actually sit back and take what happened. And so they did their job meticulously, trying to find out exactly where the threat came from and how big the threat was. A few weeks later, America struck Afghanistan, and then again there was a global expansion of terrorist activities, because the Al-Qaeda itself, the formation of Al-Qaeda, and the modus operandi of Al-Qaeda was a novelty in terms of terrorism and so on, and the way they operated their networks, their cells and so on, became very difficult. And that was why it took years, before they were able to capture Osama bin Laden and kill him. And then they now began to go after all other targets that were connected with Al-Qaeda. But again, American foreign policy too has also brought about some very difficult security concerns, not just for the United States and her allies, but all over the world. Because you now find a situation where terrorists, for instance, who are targeting European countries and targeting American interests, find it very difficult, because after 9/11 happened in the United States, it has not happened again. So they have been able to stem the tide to a very large extent. Then you had the London train bombing. It has not happened again exactly in that manner and in that form. So they have been able to stem it because again of so many security imperatives. You understand? They have the infrastructure, the intelligence, and all of that. And so what they have, the terrorists decided to do was to enlarge the scope of terrorism and the nature of terrorism, took it to other parts of the world, exporting terrorism, of course. Then in the process, we also saw the rise of ISIS, again as a result of the direct or indirect interference of the United States and Western allies in parts of the world. I mean, the Arab Spring had all kinds of consequences, the Syrian situation, then Iraq, and then again close here in Africa, the crisis in Libya that also had its own produced its own Hydra-headed monster, and then also led to massive expansion of terrorist networks all over the African continent. And since then, Africa has not exactly slept well.
And talking about the way and manner the terrorist has evolved, we now have lone wolves, those in support of this Islamic agenda, if I would say, or Islamist agenda, so to speak. But how can we, or how can you think this whole fight, against terrorists can be won when we now know that there's a new tactics involved? It's not the same plot we saw about 16 years ago where there's a particular spot they're going to. Now it's anywhere they find themselves, they just, blow up innocent lives.
Yeah, well, I think that is also the consequence of technology, the consequence of, the internet revolution and so on. And of course, that good guys use the internet to do positive things, to build their societies and so on, and then bad people also have access to the internet and they are able to also carry out their operations, that are usually inimical to the interest of a society. So that is what we have, also seen. And I think that the phenomenon of the lone wolf, I think is in a way is a slight modification of the Al-Qaeda, terror cells that we're having, because you now had different cells committed to the same ideology of destruction and terrorist ideology, but all of them working independent of each other, some not even knowing that others exist. Because you see, some of these things are a thread, they are connected by a thread. If you take out one cell, there's a possibility that it could lead you to other cells, and then till the entire operation is crippled. So this independence of action also helped to a very large extent to make it difficult for the law enforcement agencies to actually, track them down. Then the phenomenon of a lone wolf, also came up, and of course they had, a fantastic recruitment, platform. And then again, this indoctrination also, I think they perfected it, so well. And so you now had people that were sympathetic to the ideology of terrorists, the ideology of destruction and division and the rest. So they were also encouraged that wherever you are, you are in a position to also play a role towards advancing, this ideology of destruction. I put it that way, this ideology of death, and that's why you have the issue of the lone wolf, and that makes it, like you said, it brings about new dynamics, makes it more difficult, because it could just be anybody. It could just be the market woman who has been indoctrinated. It could be a little child, and we have seen that all over the world, from parts of Asia, Africa, and so many. Then the suicide bombings, all of these things, have combined to make international terrorism, to make terrorism international and not just, national.
Yeah. Now, talking about the growing magnitude of this, will I say, heinous act, some would say that the reasons attached to this growing threat to human existence it's not far-fetched. But what do you think could be the growing cause of this terrorist activities?
Well, it's first of all, it is said that in Africa, an African proverb that if you don't engage a healthy person with meaningful work activity, that the devil will find a job for him, and that is what we are seeing. And so, at the bottom line is the mass poverty, that you have in parts of the world.
Poverty, but I will still question that, because even in some modern societies, you don't see poverty in those areas. So
no.
What is the reason?
It's the ratio.
Is it I'm making a point.
I'm like, poverty plays a part. There are no two ways about it. I mean, if you put it on a ratio, on a scale, perhaps they would tell you maybe about 70%, 80% or so, is attributed to that. Then there are also those people who are not essentially poor, just like you're trying to say, but who have imbibed this ideology. So you have people who, have been able to get a direction, ideological compass, more or less, from even the Holy Book. You have people who have been able to interpret it in a particular way that suits particular mindsets and so on. So you also have that also as part of the problem also. Ignorance, I think you mentioned that also. Lack of education and the rest. But in the West, it's a different thing. Do not also forget, for instance, that in Africa and in the parts of the Middle East, the phenomenon of terrorist activities is exceedingly very, very high. So that tells you have a higher number of people who can be recruited much more easily. You understand? Unlike what you have in developed countries. But in those other places too, it's sometimes, this issue of exclusion, people have talked about it in places like Britain, in places like France and so on. This, the impression is given that in places like Britain, in places like France and so on, this, the impression is given that, that in terms of public policy, that some of these governments have not been able to properly integrate, especially the immigrants that are in their country. And so over time, that has built up, into, giving them the impression that they are not exactly, first-class citizens in those countries. So that has also brought about its own imperatives. So you see that, but like I said, it is not everybody.
All right.
Yes.
All right, let's quickly go on a quick break. You're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at the way terrorism has evolved in Africa and around the world in the last 16 years. Welcome back. Statistics in Nigeria show that Boko Haram has killed almost 30,000 people and displaced more than 2 million during a 7-year-old insurgency aimed at creating an Islamic caliphate in the country's northeast. The group, which controlled an area about the size of Belgium in early 2015, has continued to lose territories it once held, but looks far from defeated. Now, the fight against Boko Haram in Nigeria's northeast. Let's look at your assessment. How would you rate the level the Nigerian military has fought Boko Haram?
Well, in the past few months, it's been commendable, and some of us believe that this crisis would not have gotten to the level it has gotten to if the political actors had been proactive at the early stage. But be that as it may, the response and the activities of the military has been quite impressive in recent times. Some of the controversies that led to the growth and the spread of Boko Haram, to the embarrassment of the people of this country, have been tackled to a very large extent. At a time, we all know that we have a formidable military force, one of the best. We are told fighting, forces in the world, ground forces in the world. But at a time, we're on the retreat, and we're being humiliated by Boko Haram until we began to hear stories about soldiers not having enough to fight with, And since the government became much more proactive, and started supplying them with things that were needed, essential equipments that were needed to prosecute the war against Boko Haram, they have steadily and gradually, continuously beaten back the Boko Haram.
But we keep hearing reports of Boko Haram attacks.
Yeah, it's these are attacks born out of frustration. It's clear. Look, I think you were talking about the major goal of Boko Haram, and that was to create an Islamic caliphate in the southeast. But of course, it was beyond the southeast.
The northeast.
The northeast.
Right.
The plan was at the initial stage to overrun much of the north, and then when they have built a north force, then come down to the south and then Islamize, in terms of the caliphate, from their own perspective, of the demands of Islam, Islamize the entire country. But that has not happened. So what is going on? The fact that they have been losing, territories is something that they are not exactly happy about, but they cannot do anything about it because of the operational efficiency of the Nigerian military. The plan was to take this territory, and of course, by the time they took these territories, they were already putting administrations in place. Yeah, they put their flag and then put an administrator and all of that until the military began to fight back and began to take all of these territories. So that means that a major aspect of their campaign has been defeated. And so what you see as sporadic attacks usually against soft targets. At a time, the Boko Haram was strong enough to attack major military installations in the northeast and overrun them. You understand? Now it is no longer happening. So they are hitting soft spots, they are still hitting churches, they are still hitting markets, and banks.
Soft targets generally.
Soft targets and all of that. And then, of course, using the suicide bombers and all of that. So this is not, initially, it wasn't their calculation. By now, in terms of their planning and their strategy, I'm sure that the plan was that they would have perhaps taken over the entire north. But the fact that they can no longer hold territories is a very serious indictment on their ability to cause the kind of damage they were causing. They are still causing damages, they are still causing fear and panic. All of these bombings and so on is just to tell Nigerians that they are far from over. And actually they are far from over.
Okay, so if they're far from over, so we say that is it safe to say that the security, the challenge of tackling this, menace is really, really difficult on the part of the Nigerian military?
Well, it's not just a military issue, and I think we'll be making a mistake. The military aspect of tackling Boko Haram is one thing. It was just like the U.S., for instance, when they invaded Iraq, and there was no proper exit plan, and people had warned about that earlier. So when they began to suffer so much losses and the rest, the citizens themselves of Iraq were fighting the forces who had told the whole world that they were coming to democratize the place. And so they now realized that, look, they needed to get at the hearts and minds of the average Iraqi. What does that mean? You need to have a political process that would lead to certain, economic policies that would begin to answer to the basic needs of the ordinary people. Because for as long as you think that this is just, something that can be won militarily, you'll be making a mistake. Because there are millions of poor people in the north that have become cannon fodder in this process. People that are paid, I was told, as little as 5,000 naira. You understand? And because they have no other means of livelihood, they see that money, as small as it is, as something that no other person would have.
Keep body and soul together.
Yeah, to keep body and soul together. So that kind of thing attracts them. So if you don't begin to address, deep economic issues that lead to frustration, and deprivation, you're going to continue to have something. They would always have an army of people that are willing, to join them, and then to join in whatever mayhem, people who are not motivated by any kind of, ideology that helps the growth and development of society.
All right, on a larger scale now, how much longer do you think it would take to decimate groups like the Al-Shabaab, the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and all other terrorist groups around the globe?
You can't put a time frame on it, I can assure you, because I remember when I think it was Bade, when he was made the chief of army staff, he was sounding so enthusiastic and and excited. And I remember turning to somebody, I said, this man doesn't seem to understand what is at stake, what is at play in this particular matter. You cannot, when things like this, terrorist organizations and terrorist groups get to the level that they have gotten to in the country or in the world and so on, it's not something you can put a time frame on. It's a continuous, meticulous work that you have to keep on doing. And as you're doing it, that is at one level through intelligence, actionable intelligence, and then the engagement by security forces with these people wherever you can find them. And then the socio-economic realities on the ground also have to be addressed. Because I remember clearly, and I think the Americans were quite, forthright about it. They said it was going to take decades before they can overcome, this international terrorism at the level that of course, we have seen is going to about 2 decades now since 9/11 happened. And so the Nigerian situation, a lot of us thought that it was going to be a matter of weeks before they were able to put it down. This is not like Metasini. Metasini was different. They made the mistake of engaging the military in a conventional warfare, and they paid the price. This is completely different. And so it is still going to take years, to, I think, bring it to an end. It is going to take a lot of time. But a lot of work, a lot more work needs to be done.
And talking about a lot more work, are we looking at international community, coming together in terms of the African Union, in terms of other regional blocs on the continent, so that this, this practice that is taking root, not only in other countries around the world, but in Africa especially, is, put to a final stop?
They've been at it. They've been talking about it. They've had conferences, they've had meetings, they've had discussions. There has been cooperations, inter government cooperations. Of course, the Chad Basin, development also between Nigeria, Niger. Is it Chad and so? I mean, Cameroon, they are all working together because it has become international. Of course, when we had a similar situation in Mali, of course, the international community, including France and some of these other countries, were also involved. And then the crisis in Libya, too, led to what is going on. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we might not want to pass blame, but direct policies of the Western powers and the United States have been responsible for the spread of terrorism all over the world. There are no two ways about it. And then so you have some other countries that are now bearing the consequences of what is going on, because at the same level, there are deep-rooted problems, socioeconomic problems in those countries that are just now beginning to rear their head because maybe the time is ripe for that kind of thing. I don't know.
So if the deep-rooted economic social problems, like you mentioned, is really handled, perhaps we won't be where we are today. Am I correct?
Once people are meaningfully engaged in economic activities, most people, the vast majority of them would not have time for things that would destabilize their basic family responsibilities and so on. You see, most of these people that are involved in this, apart from the top level in terms of the hierarchy, most of the soldiers or the foot soldiers of these organizations do not have any stake. They have nothing to look forward to. Some of them are not educated. Even the educated ones too. There are so many socioeconomic issues on ground that makes it easier for people to have a grudge against states. And that is the critical issue. People do not believe that they have any stake in the country, that they do not have any, that they have no, that they have a stake in their nation,
whatever they believe
because the nation has not exactly done anything for them. So for as long as you continue to have this mindset, any organization that comes and makes some promises, to them of maybe resolving some of the contradictions of the time in their favor, the possibility of them lending sympathetic ears or giving them sympathetic ears, it's always very, very high. So governments across the continent must do everything within their power to begin to address some of the socioeconomic problems today that are blighting the Nigerian people and Africans in general. They need to. It is critical. so that they will be able to arrest the tendency to want to be dragged, along that path of destruction.
All right. All right. Thanks a lot very much. We really appreciate your analysis so far on the program. Achike Chude, security expert and political analyst in Nigeria. We appreciate your thoughts with us. Unfortunately, we couldn't get Dr. Martin Ewe, but we'll appreciate him all the same if he was to have joined us earlier on the show. Well, whether Al-Shabaab in Somalia or Boko Haram in Nigeria, the war against terror has shown that no country can be an island of prosperity in an ocean of insecurity. 16 years after breaking moments of 9/11, insurgency has taken unimaginable dimensions, creating a need for nations to join forces, share intelligence, and fight terror to a standstill. And that is our package for today. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG, and also follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one, I am Esther Mokwariola, and always remember, change starts with you.